She had been in that room for 4 months. 4 months without sunlight. 4 months without her son's voice. 4 months in a space so small she could not fully extend her legs, eating what was brought when something was brought, sleeping on a mat that had not been changed since the first week, in darkness that was broken only by the thin line of light that came under the door at irregular intervals and told her that the world outside was still continuing without her. She was 80 years old. She had raised a son from nothing. She had worked with her hands and her back and every hour she had available for 30 years so that he could go to school, so that he could become what he became, so that the name she had given him would mean something in the world. And she was in a cage. Not a metaphorical cage. Not the cage of neglect or the cage of loneliness that elderly people are placed in when families stop visiting. A physical, constructed cage, metal bars, a lock, a door that opened only from the outside. Nobody in that house knew she was alive. Nobody except the woman who had put her there. And on a Tuesday night in November, at 11:47 in the evening, a maid named Comfort heard something through a wall that she was not supposed to hear. What she did next would cost her everything she had built in that house. And it would save the life of a woman the world had been told was already dead. Welcome, friends. Welcome to today's story. If you are watching for the first time, please subscribe, like, and share this video right now. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from: Lagos, London, Accra, New York, Johannesburg, Toronto, wherever you are in this world, we want to know. This story is for everyone who has ever been invisible. For everyone who has ever been erased. And for every person who found the courage to act when acting meant losing everything. Stay with us. Because what this poor maid found at midnight is one of the most shocking and most powerful things you will hear today. The Osei mansion had 22 rooms. Comfort Mensah knew all of them. She had cleaned all of them, maintained all of them, moved through all of them with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has been doing this kind of work for long enough that the geography of a wealthy house becomes as familiar as her own body. She knew which floorboards creaked on the east corridor. She knew which windows let in drafts when the wind came from the north. She knew the specific acoustics of each room, the way sound moved differently in the library, the way the kitchen amplified voices from 2 rooms away. She had worked in the Osei household for 6 years. She had arrived when the first Mrs. Osei was still alive, when the house had a different quality to it, a warmth that expressed itself in small and daily ways. Fresh flowers in the entrance hall that the first Mrs. Osei chose herself every Monday morning. Music from the sitting room on Sunday afternoons. And most significantly, the presence of Mama Abina, Kwame Osei's mother, who came every other weekend and sat in the garden and shelled beans and told stories and laughed with a completeness that filled whatever room she occupied. The first Mrs. Osei died of cancer 3 years after Comfort arrived. Kwame Osei's grief was the genuine grief of a man who had loved his wife and who did not know how to carry what her absence left. He had thrown himself into his business with the specific desperation of someone trying to outrun feeling, and for 2 years he had traveled constantly, building and acquiring and expanding, and the house had been quiet with his absence and quiet with its loss. Then he brought home Sylvia. Sylvia Osei, formerly Sylvia Darko, was 36 years old, 17 years younger than Kwame, with pale brown skin and chemically straightened black hair she wore in a precise blow-dried style that never appeared to move. She was beautiful in a way that had been carefully engineered over years of deliberate attention to appearance, and she carried herself with the specific confidence of a woman who has learned to convert beauty into power and is very skilled at the conversion. She had met Kwame at a charity gala. She had been introduced by a mutual acquaintance. She had known, with the calculating precision of someone who has studied this kind of target, exactly what to offer and how to offer it. Within 8 months, they were married. Comfort watched all of this from the corners of rooms. The first changes were subtle. The flowers in the entrance hall were replaced with sculptural arrangements from a specific designer whose pieces were expensive and lifeless. The music on Sunday afternoons stopped. The house acquired more security, additional cameras, additional guards, additional systems that monitored movement and logged entries and created a surveillance architecture that Comfort understood, at a level below articulation, was not installed to protect the household from outside threats. And then, 6 weeks after the wedding, Kwame Osei's mother stopped visiting. Comfort noticed this before she questioned it. Mama Abina had been a constant of the house for 6 years, her visits as reliable as weather, her presence as familiar as the garden itself. And then one weekend she did not come. And the following weekend. And the weekend after. When Comfort asked the housekeeper, a woman named Alma who had been with the family for 12 years, Alma's face performed a complicated expression and she said, "Mama Abina passed. Quietly. In her sleep. Mr. Osei is devastated but he prefers not to discuss it." Comfort accepted this because grief is private and people grieve differently, and who was she to question what a man chose to disclose about his mother's death? She accepted it. But something filed itself away in her, some small, unverified, wordless register of wrongness that her body kept even while her mind moved on. 3 months after Sylvia arrived, certain parts of the house were declared off-limits. The East Wing, a section of the ground floor that had previously housed a storage room and a small guest bathroom, was locked. The key was kept by Sylvia personally. The household staff were told, through Sylvia's assistant, that renovations were planned and the area was unsafe. They were told this once, and not again, and the expectation was clear that it did not require discussion. Comfort cleaned the corridors outside the East Wing and noticed things. She noticed that food trays, not the household's normal service trays, but plain covered trays she did not recognize, disappeared from the kitchen at irregular intervals. They were not on the household's meal roster. They did not correspond to any guest or resident she was aware of. They appeared and disappeared with a pattern she could not map to anything official. She noticed that the East Wing, which was supposed to be undergoing renovation, produced no renovation sounds during the day. No drilling, no hammering, no workers arriving or departing, no building materials delivered to the compound. She noticed, on 2 separate occasions, sounds she could not fully identify, sounds that came through the wall that separated the east corridor from the rest of the ground floor. Sounds that were too low to be mechanical, too irregular to be pipes. Sounds that her body identified before her mind did, and that her mind then immediately reclassified as something explicable, because the alternative was not something she was ready to examine. And then came the Tuesday in November. Comfort was in the kitchen at 11:40 at night. She had stayed late, a request from Sylvia's assistant that she prepare a specific dish for a guest the following morning, a task that required preparation the night before. She was alone in the kitchen. The house was quiet. Sylvia had retired to the master bedroom 2 hours earlier. The security guards were at their stations outside. She heard it through the wall. A sound. Barely audible. Barely a sound at all. More like the memory of a sound, the frequency of something that had been making itself heard for a long time in a space where no one was listening. Crying. Not the crying of distress or pain, which carries volume and urgency. The crying of someone who has been crying for so long that the sound has been reduced to its minimum, the involuntary residue of tears that have not stopped simply because nothing has stopped them. The sound of someone who has been crying alone in the dark for so long that they no longer expect anyone to hear. Comfort stood in the kitchen and listened. She stood there for 4 minutes, not moving, not breathing fully, listening to that sound and understanding, with a clarity that arrived not gradually but all at once, complete and devastating, what it was. Someone was in the East Wing. Someone alive. Someone suffering. Someone who had been there long enough to have cried this way. She knew what would happen if she was found in a locked area of the house she had been explicitly told to avoid. Dismissal at minimum. Accusations of theft or trespassing. The specific vulnerability of a domestic worker whose employment is the entirety of her security, accused by a wealthy employer, with no witness and no protection. She knew all of this. She stood in the kitchen and listed it in her mind, item by item, with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who does not allow herself the comfort of pretending that courage comes without cost. Then she found the key. It was not difficult to find. Sylvia kept her personal keys on a hook inside the master bedroom, inaccessible while she was awake, but accessible during the hours she slept, for a woman who knew the layout of that bedroom and knew that Sylvia's sleep, assisted by the medication she took each night, was deep and uninterrupted. Comfort had never taken anything from that bedroom. She had cleaned it every day for 18 months and had never removed anything that was not hers to remove. She took the key. She walked to the east wing. She unlocked the metal door. Friends, she is opening a door that was never supposed to be opened. Whatever is behind that door is going to change everything in that house. Subscribe and like this video right now. Because what this maid finds on the other side of that door, what has been hidden behind that locked wall for months, is the most shocking and most heartbreaking thing in this entire story. Keep watching. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. The specific smell of a small, unventilated space in which a human being has been living for a long time, the smell of unwashed skin and unwashed fabric and the particular staleness of air that has not moved freely in months. The smell of illness, of inadequate food, of a body being slowly reduced by neglect. Comfort pressed her hand over her mouth. She reached for the light switch on the wall inside the door. A single bare bulb came on. What she saw in the light of that bulb was something that her mind processed in pieces because the full picture arrived too fast and too complete for the mind to receive all at once. A room, roughly 4 meters by 3. No window. A concrete floor with a thin plastic mat. A bucket in one corner. A metal structure in the center of the room, not large, perhaps 2 meters long by 1 meter wide, constructed of metal bars welded together, with a flat base and a hinged door secured with a padlock. The structure of an animal cage. The dimensions of a storage enclosure. Inside it, on a folded blanket that had once been blue and was now the color of extended use, was a woman. She was small, her smallness exaggerated by the cage, by the curled position her body had found, by the months of inadequate food that had reduced her frame to something that appeared too fragile to be alive. Her skin was deep brown and ashen simultaneously, the specific grayish cast of severe dehydration overlying dark skin. Her hair was white and uncombed and had grown long, spreading around her head. Her clothing, a thin cotton house dress, once patterned, now unrecognizable in its fading, was torn at the sleeve and stained. On her arms and on the visible skin of her legs were bruises in various stages of healing, purple and yellow and the dark brown of older injuries. She appeared to be unconscious. Comfort crossed the room in 3 steps. She crouched before the cage. The woman's eyes opened. They were clear eyes. That was the first thing that struck Comfort with a force that bypassed all other sensation. The body was devastated, but the eyes that opened and found Comfort's face in the dim light of that room were completely, heartbreakingly clear. The eyes of a person who was still entirely present inside the wreckage of what had been done to her body. The woman's lips moved. Comfort leaned closer. "Water," the woman whispered. "Please." Comfort was back in the kitchen and back in the room in minutes. She brought water and the small covered bowl of food she had been preparing for the following morning. She brought them through the lock, which she now understood from its construction, and through the cage door, which used the same key. She held the water to the woman's lips with hands that shook with an emotion she was not yet allowing herself to fully feel because feeling it would slow her down, and this woman needed the water first. The woman drank. She drank with the specific urgency of someone who has been conserving hope for so long that its arrival undoes them. She drank and then she pressed Comfort's hand and she wept, not the diminished nighttime weeping Comfort had heard through the wall, but something larger and more complete, the weeping of someone who has been found after believing they had become unfindable. Comfort held her hand through the bars. When the weeping quieted, Comfort asked, "What is your name?" The woman looked at her. "Abina," she said. "Abina Osei." The name arrived in Comfort's chest like a blow. She looked at the woman before her. At the white hair. At the deep brown skin. At the clear eyes that Comfort had seen before, in a face that appeared every other weekend in this garden, in a woman who shelled beans and told stories and laughed with her entire body. She had been told Mama Abina was dead. She had been told it once, by a colleague, and she had filed it and moved on and not questioned it because death is private and people grieve differently, and she was a maid, not a member of the family, and it was not her place. She looked at the woman in the cage. She was not dead. She had been imprisoned, in her own son's house, in a cage built in a locked room in a wing that had been declared off-limits to the staff, for a period that the state of her body communicated was measured in months rather than weeks. Comfort sat on the concrete floor of that room for a long time. She sat and she held Mama Abina's hand through the bars and she listened. Mama Abina spoke in fragments, her voice was weak and the account came in pieces, but the architecture of it was clear. Sylvia had moved against her in the weeks following the wedding, isolating her systematically, intercepting her calls to Kwame, feeding him a constructed narrative about a mother who had become difficult and confused, whose behavior was embarrassing, whose presence was disrupting the new household. Kwame, consumed by his grief and his new marriage and his business, had accepted what he was told and had visited less and less and then not at all. The declaration of her death had come from Sylvia, delivered to the household staff and, Mama Abina believed, to Kwame himself, a fabrication built on forged medical documents that Sylvia, with the resources she had access to through Kwame's wealth, had apparently found possible to construct. Mama Abina had been brought to this room under the pretext of a medical appointment. She had not left it since. She said all of this without self-pity and without the performance of victimhood, in the flat and factual tone of someone who has had months of darkness in which to arrive at the precise truth of what happened to them. She said it the way a person reports a crime, clearly, chronologically, without the embellishment of feeling because the feeling had already been fully processed in the dark. Comfort came back every night. She came at the same time, between 11 and midnight, after Sylvia's medicated sleep had stabilized. She brought food and water and, when she could acquire them without detection, medicine for the infection that had developed in Mama Abina's left leg from a wound that had not been properly cleaned. She cleaned the wound herself. She brought clean clothes, piece by piece, replacing what was there with items she sourced from the household laundry where they would not be missed. She brought a comb and she combed the old woman's hair with a gentleness she did not announce. And she kept the secret, the most expensive secret she had ever kept, while the days passed and the weight of knowing pressed down on her with increasing force. Sylvia noticed something. She did not know what she had noticed, but she noticed that the East Wing supply trays were arriving more consistently than she had arranged, and that the woman inside was surviving with more stability than neglect alone would have maintained. She turned her surveillance toward the household staff. Her eyes became more specific in their attention. She came to Comfort one afternoon while Comfort was sweeping the east corridor. She said, with the specific coldness of someone issuing a warning they have designed to seem like conversation, "I've noticed you've been working late. I hope you aren't going anywhere you shouldn't." Comfort looked at her. She said, "I am always exactly where I should be, madam." Sylvia held the look for a long moment. Then she walked away. And that night, when Comfort went to the East Wing, she found that the padlock on Mama Abina's cage had been changed, and that the food tray that should have been left that morning had not arrived, and that Mama Abina had been without water since the previous evening. She sat on the floor and held Mama Abina's hand through the bars and she made a decision. She could not keep this secret any longer. But before she could determine how to break it, the breaking was taken out of her hands. Friends, an 80-year-old woman in a cage in her own son's house. A maid who discovered the truth and has been carrying it alone. And a wife who suspects that someone is about to destroy everything she has built. Subscribe and like this video. Ask yourself this: what would you do if you were Comfort? If speaking meant losing everything, and staying silent meant watching a woman disappear, which would you choose? Keep watching. Because the next part of this story is the one that changes everything. It was a Friday evening. Kwame Osei was in Abuja. He was expected back Sunday. Sylvia had confirmed this herself during her afternoon phone call, which Comfort had overheard from the kitchen, confirming his return date with the specific satisfaction of someone who is calculating time remaining. Comfort was at the entrance to the east corridor when she heard the sounds. Not the nighttime sounds of a woman crying alone. These were different sounds, louder, directional, carrying the particular acoustic signature of two people in the same space, one of whom had a voice and one of whom did not. Sylvia's voice. Through the locked door, muffled but decipherable, Comfort heard words she would not repeat afterward with precision because precision was not necessary. The substance was clear. The substance was cruelty performing itself without the need for an audience, without even the audience of the person it was directed at, because the old woman in the cage was not an audience worth performing for. She was simply a thing being reminded, in the specific language of someone who has long since abandoned the pretense of justification, that she did not matter, had never mattered, and would not survive long enough for mattering to become relevant again. Then came a sound that was not words. The sound of something striking something. The specific acoustic signature of force applied to a body. Comfort had the East Wing key in her hand. She had acquired a copy made from wax impression 3 weeks earlier, a transgression she had committed with full knowledge of its cost. She unlocked the door. She walked through the storage area. She unlocked the inner room. The bare bulb came on. Sylvia was standing before the cage. She was wearing a silk robe and had clearly come from her evening preparations, her hair partially done, makeup half applied, a glass of something in her left hand. Her right hand was raised. She had not yet registered that the door had opened. In the cage, Mama Abina was pressed to the back bars. Her lip was bleeding. Fresh blood on her chin that had not been there when Comfort had visited at 11 the previous night. Her eyes were open and they found Comfort's face across the room with the immediate, specific recognition of someone who has been waiting for someone to come. Sylvia turned. Her expression moved through surprise, through the rapid calculation of a woman assessing threat, and settled into the cold contempt of someone who believes that her status makes her immune to consequence. She said, "You have no idea what you have walked into." Comfort looked at her. She looked at her for a long time. This woman in her silk robe, this woman who had built a lie elegant enough to imprison an 80-year-old woman and convince a son his mother was dead, this woman who was standing in a locked room in the dark striking a frail body through the bars of a cage she had constructed. Something in Comfort that had been held for months, held with the specific discipline of someone who knows that emotion, if released at the wrong moment, destroys the possibility of action, came undone. She crossed the room. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that the action itself did not say more completely. She struck Sylvia Osei across the face with the full force of her right hand. The sound of it filled the small room. Sylvia's head snapped sideways. The glass fell. It shattered on the concrete floor. Sylvia stumbled backward, one hand flying to her face, her expression moving through shock and into a rage that was also, underneath the rage, the first genuine fear she had allowed herself in a long time. "You are finished," Sylvia said. Her voice shook. "You are finished. I will have you arrested. I will have you deported. I will make sure you never work in this country again. I will." The door to the East Wing opened. Both women went still. Footsteps in the storage area, not the footsteps of household staff. The footsteps of someone who knew how to walk through a space he owned. Heavy, deliberate, and moving with the velocity of a man who has come home earlier than expected and has been following sounds through his own house for the past 60 seconds. Kwame Osei appeared in the doorway of the inner room. He was wearing his travel suit, the dark navy he wore for the Abuja trips. His carry-on bag was still over his shoulder. His flight had landed 4 hours early. He had come directly home. He had entered his house to find it quiet and dark in the ways it should not have been quiet and dark, and he had followed the sounds, and the sounds had led him here. He stood in the doorway and he looked at the room. At Sylvia, her cheek reddened, her robe disordered, her expression a compound of fury and terror. At Comfort, standing with her hand at her side, tears she had not noticed falling on her own face. At the cage. At the woman inside the cage. Kwame Osei looked at the woman inside the cage. The woman inside the cage looked back at him. She said, in a voice made small by months of diminishment but made completely clear by love that had never required volume to be present. Kwame. The sound that came from Kwame Osei's chest in that moment was not a word and not a cry and not the sound of a man who has been in control of himself for 47 years and knows how to manage what he feels in professional and private circumstances alike. It was the sound of something breaking that had never, in 47 years of living, broken before, the sound of a man's entire understanding of his life collapsing in a single second. He said, "Mama." He said it the way a person says the name of someone they believed was gone, with the specific disbelief of a word returning from the dead, with the unbearable mixture of joy and grief and the specific, crushing guilt of someone who understands, in this single moment, that the believed absence was not an absence at all. He looked at Sylvia. His face was a thing comfort would not be able to fully describe afterward, because it was the expression of a man who has loved someone and trusted someone and discovered simultaneously that the love was used and the trust was weaponized and that while he was building his empire and carrying his grief and accepting what he was told by a woman whose beauty he had confused with goodness, his mother, his 80-year-old mother who had worked her hands raw so he could become what he became, had been in a cage in the locked wing of his own house. He said nothing to Sylvia. He walked to the cage. He tried the padlock. He looked at Comfort. "The key," she said. She gave it to him. Friends, the billionaire is on his knees before his mother's cage. His wife's lie is in this room with all of them. And the maid who struck his wife is standing behind him, knowing that what comes next will cost her everything. Subscribe and like this video right now. Because what happens in the next few minutes, the truth that comes out of this room, will change every person in it forever. Keep watching. Kwame Osei opened the cage with hands that shook. He opened it and he reached inside and he gathered his mother into his arms with the specific and devastating carefulness of a man holding something that has almost been lost past recovery, carefully, as if she might break, and completely, as if he would never let go. Mama Abina allowed herself to be held. She was too weak to hold him back with full force, but her arms came around him and her face pressed against his shoulder and she cried, not the diminished nighttime crying, not the residue crying of someone alone in darkness, but the deep, full, unlocked crying of someone who has been found. Comfort stood by the door and watched this and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel the full weight of what she had been carrying. It was enormous. It was the most enormous thing she had ever carried and she had not fully known its dimensions until this moment, when she put it down. Kwame stayed on the floor of the cage room holding his mother for a time that Comfort did not measure. When he finally rose, when he helped Mama Abina to stand with the careful assistance of someone navigating an unfamiliar fragility, when he turned to face the room, Sylvia was still there. She had not run. Perhaps she had calculated that running would confirm everything. Perhaps she had convinced herself, in the specific and breathtaking arrogance of someone who has operated without consequence for a long time, that she could still construct a version of this that favored her. Perhaps she simply did not have anywhere to go. She began speaking. The version she offered was the version of someone working with the debris of a collapsed lie, attempting to build something navigable from the wreckage. There were reasons. There were contexts. Mama Abina had been difficult, had been dangerous, had required containment for her own safety. The documentation of her death had been a legal complexity, a misunderstanding, Kwame said, "Stop." One word. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Sylvia stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at his mother, leaning against him, her small frail body inside the cage it had just left, her white hair uncombed, her lips still bleeding from the evening's visit, the bruises on her arms telling their own story in the bare light of that room. He looked at Sylvia and he said, "How long?" It was not a question. Sylvia's face shifted. "For months," Comfort said quietly from the doorway. Kwame turned to look at her, This woman in her household uniform who had been in his house for 6 years and whom he had never looked at with the specific attention he was bringing to bear now. He looked at her face. He looked at the tears on it that she had stopped trying to wipe. He looked at the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying an enormous weight alone for a very long time. "Tell me everything," he said. She told him. She told him from the beginning, from the food trays she had noticed, from the sounds through the wall, from the night she had taken the key. She told him about the cage. She told him about Mama Abina's condition when she found her, about the water, about the wound on the left leg, about the nightly visits and the food brought in pieces and the hair combed in the dark. She told him about Sylvia's warning in the east corridor and about the changed lock and the missed food tray and about what she had heard through the door that evening. She told him all of it. She told it without embellishment and without the performance of heroism, because heroism was not how she had experienced any of it. She had experienced it as necessity, as the only available option for a person who had discovered something that could not be undiscovered, and she offered it the same way. When she finished, the room was silent except for the sound of Mama Abina's breathing, still slightly labored, still carrying the accumulated weight of 4 months of inadequate care. Kwame looked at his wife. He said, "Get out of my house." Sylvia's mouth opened. He said, "If you are here when I return from taking my mother to the hospital, I will call the police before I call my lawyers. You choose the order." Something in Sylvia's face, the constructed surface of it, the engineered beauty and engineered warmth and engineered grief that she had deployed with such skill for 2 years, came apart. What was underneath it was not what anyone would have expected or hoped to find. It was not remorse. It was not grief. It was the specific hollowness of someone who has been exposed not as evil but as empty, someone for whom other people had never been fully real, for whom an 80-year-old woman in a cage had been a management problem rather than a human being. She left. She left without her luggage, without her carefully curated possessions, without the silk robe she was still wearing, because Kwame Osei's voice had communicated, without shouting and without any further elaboration, that remaining in that house for 1 additional minute was not an option she had. Kwame called an ambulance. While they waited, he sat beside his mother on the concrete floor of the room that had held her, because she was too weak to walk to the main house without assistance and because he would not leave her in this room again for any duration, however brief. Comfort sat on the other side. The 3 of them sat on the concrete floor in the light of the bare bulb and they waited for the sound of the ambulance. Mama Abina held a hand on each side. She held Kwame's hand on her right and Comfort's hand on her left and she looked at the ceiling of the room that had held her and she said nothing for a long time. When she spoke to Kwame, not with accusation, not with the weight of what he had failed to see and failed to do, but with the specific and enormous love of a mother who understands that her child was deceived and who has decided, in the months of darkness during which she had processed every possible direction this could go, that love was the only response that served anything. She said, "You came." Kwame's head went down. He said, "I should have come sooner. Mama. I should have." She pressed his hand. She said, "You came." That was all. The ambulance arrived. Mama Abina was taken to the hospital where, over the following days, the attending doctors documented the full extent of what 4 months of imprisonment and deliberate neglect had done to an 80-year-old body. The documentation they produced, methodical, clinical, photograph-supported, became, in the weeks that followed, the foundation of a legal case that moved with a speed unusual for such proceedings, driven by the specificity of the evidence and by the resources of a man who had spent 2 years trusting the wrong person and who redirected, with complete and focused intensity, everything he had toward ensuring that the trust was the last thing the wrong person would ever extract from him. Sylvia Osei was arrested 48 hours after she left the house. She was charged with unlawful imprisonment, assault occasioning bodily harm, and fraud relating to the falsification of a death record. She did not, in the end, have access to the resources she had expected to access in her defense. Kwame Osei's lawyers had moved faster than hers, and the accounts she had expected to draw on were no longer accessible in the ways she had planned. The trial took 7 months. The verdict was not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention. Comfort Mensah received a letter of dismissal on the Monday following the Friday night. She had expected this. She had expected it from the moment she crossed the East Corridor with the key in her hand, had carried the expectation alongside the secret, had held them both, had decided that the dismissal was a price that the situation required and that she would pay it. The letter was brief. It cited conduct unbecoming of a household employee. It cited the physical assault. It cited the unauthorized access to a restricted area of the property. It was legally precise and entirely accurate in its accounting of what she had done. Beneath the formal letter, in an envelope attached to it, was a handwritten note. Kwame Osei's handwriting, she recognized it from the household correspondence she had managed for 6 years. It said, "I know that a letter of dismissal is not the correct response to what you did. I know that what you did in this house is not something that a letter of dismissal can address in any honest way. I am writing this letter because you are owed an honest accounting, not because I believe you deserve to be dismissed. I am writing it because the law requires that I address what happened, and I am writing it this way because I want you to know that I understand the difference between the letter and the truth." The note continued, "My mother is alive because you found her. She is alive because you went back every night when going back cost you something. She is alive because you are the kind of person who cannot look at an injustice and file it under someone else's problem. I have met very few people in my life who are that kind of person. I did not know, until Friday night, that you were one of them. I should have known sooner. I should have paid better attention to the people in my own house. That failure is mine to carry." The note ended, "There will be a position available for you in my household when you want it. The decision is entirely yours. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that what you did will not be forgotten, by me or by my mother, for as long as either of us is alive." Comfort read the note twice. She folded it and placed it in the inside pocket of her good bag, beside the documentation of her service and the record of her employment history that she would need for her next application, wherever that took her. She visited Mama Abina in the hospital on the Thursday of the following week. She brought food, proper food, the kind she had been preparing in the Osei kitchen for 6 years, and she sat beside the bed and watched Mama Abina eat with the specific, profound pleasure of someone eating freely in the light. Mama Abina looked at her and said, "Sit down, my daughter. Eat with me." Comfort sat down. She ate. And in that hospital room, in the ordinary warmth of 2 women sharing food, something that had been broken was quietly and completely restored. Not the job. Not the position or the salary or the security of employment. Something older and more essential than any of those things. The knowledge that what she had done was worth doing. The knowledge that the woman across from her was eating because she had acted. The knowledge that when the moment had arrived, when standing up meant falling down, when speaking meant being silenced, when courage meant losing everything, she had not looked away. She had gone through the locked door. And on the other side of the locked door was a life. That was enough. That was everything. She did not need a reward to know she had done right. She did not need recognition to confirm that the cost was worth paying. She needed only this, a woman eating in the light, who had been dying in the dark, who was alive because one person decided that a locked door was not a final answer. That is what courage looks like when it belongs to the poorest woman in the house. That is what it costs. That is what it saves. And that is why it will always, always be worth it.